So welcome back to the Overseas Athlete Podcast, and today we have a very different type of guest for you. I'm very excited to introduce Matt Krog, who is one of the directors of Hope Earl Lawyers on the Gold Coast here in Queensland. Matt, good afternoon or good morning still. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
No, I'm very much looking forward to this. As a just sort of mentioned briefly off air, so for those that you can do a bit of research on Matt, but he's a lawyer here on the Gold Coast with a sporting background and heavily passionate about helping sports people and athletes on the legal side of things. So I thought it'd be a fantastic episode. I had a couple of conversations last week with a few basketballers, so one American and one Australian, and they've played in between them sort of 15 different countries, and their biggest obstacle or challenge or sort of, I guess, stress as well was their contracts. Obviously, if you're not if you're an athlete, you're probably not well versed in the ins and outs of contracts and different sort of sports laws and what you're entitled to. So, Matt, that's the reason to get you on, is to get your insights around, how important they are, what questions athletes should ask, things they should look out for, and really just to make sure we can help educate and protect them. So, if you want to give us a bit of a background as to who you are and what you do, and we'll just dive in from there.
Yeah, easy. No, sounds good. So as you said, I've been working as a corporate commercial and employment lawyer probably for the last 10 years, but really have focused on the sports industry. So the sports law in itself is really a collection of a number of areas of law. So for me, it's important to have a good grounding in commercial, corporate, and employment to be able to advise athletes or agents, even coaches, in relation to various aspects of the work that they do. So over the last 10 years, I've been advising national sporting organisations, player agents, athletes, and as I said, coaches as well, in relation to every aspect of the law, really. So from selection disputes, disciplinary matters, even corporate structuring when you're setting up your own business, or on the other end, disputes between athletes and agents and athletes, and things like that. So sort of cover a wide range of things there with the sporting industry generally. So
fantastic.
As you touched on as well, I think the main role of a sports lawyer, for athletes in particular, is really just around sort of education. So sometimes you don't necessarily need to change things. You just need to make sure that athletes are actually aware of what they're signing up for, what their sort of options are, and making sure that the agreement sort of reflects their understanding of what they're signing up for. Because obviously you have agents there that can assist most of the time in most sports, but obviously agents have a sort of a wide range of things that they need to consider, and sometimes they need a lawyer as well to actually assist in understanding the terms of the contract, assisting with the negotiations as well, especially when you start getting into the sort of the nitty-gritty and the details of certain transactions. So that's where we sort of come in. We don't try and sort of take over the situation. It's more to sit on the side and make sure athletes and agents feel like they've got another member on their team, making sure that everything's been steered in the right direction and ultimately protecting the athlete's interests.
Yeah, and it's so important. And as I said at the start there, it's probably an area that people really don't know much about. I suppose the main things you look at when you see it is how much am I getting paid and when, like how often.
Yeah, well, that's right.
That's the two things that stand out, obviously, for everyone, whether it's just a standard employment contract or a playing contract.
Yeah.
But what would be, from your own experience, some of the main, I guess, issues or areas where people might get caught out that they weren't aware of?
Yeah, well, it really depends on where the athlete is looking to sign. So domestically, things are pretty consistent, but when you start looking at overseas contracts, that's when things become a little more unclear. Obviously, moving into a different jurisdiction, they might operate under a different legal system than what we have over here. So there could be a lot of things that are different over there than the athlete's probably not aware of. And the main thing there is really in relation to sort of personal information. So how is your information used? What can it be used for? How long can it be used for? Those are the kind of things that you probably should look at as an athlete. It's got a lot of attention recently locally. A lot of people are talking about the sensitive information that's actually being collected by clubs in relation to athletes. So whether it's health data, or, even the GPS tracking, things like that. Athletes are starting to ask more questions about what's happening to my information, because it is sensitive, and there is certain protections that athletes have here in Australia. But that's not to say that the same protections apply overseas.
Yeah.
So we're always looking at that. We're looking at image rights as well. So image rights, you obviously heard a lot about the nil deals over in the US. You always hear it. Nil obviously stands for name, image, and likeness. So in Australia, there's really no recognised right to a person's image. So most of the protections for athletes come through the entry into contracts. So athletes that are wary of how their image might be used would need to have a look at not only their contract, but then if there's any other sort of CBA that's been entered into with any other organisations over there. You need to really have a look at that and see if there are any protections in relation to the use of your image. And to what extent are you protected? To what extent do you have any control over the use of that image? So it sort of does go deeper there. And obviously, again, as I said, you're moving into a different jurisdiction. So you really want to know, how do things differ from how they are here? And we can advise on the Australian side of things. But then also it's always worthwhile to have a lawyer over in the jurisdiction in which the athlete's signing to actually provide some advice there, so that the athlete has a clear understanding of what's going on. And of course, at this current moment, I think there's a lot of more money being thrown at sports, both locally and internationally. And previously, I think it's the cost of engaging a lawyer has sort of been deterring other athletes from getting that advice. But from our perspective, sometimes there's little work required, sometimes there's a lot of work required, but it's always good to just be informed and receive that advice, so that you're not taking that leap of faith blindly. Because as you said, some athletes might jump over into another country and then realize it wasn't what they thought it was going to be, and had they received advice, had the benefit of that advice, and maybe they would have made a different decision.
And on the we'll touch on a bit of that, jumping into new countries, but just on the image side of things. So as just say, a young Australian athlete, whether they're playing in the NRL, AFL, the A-League here in Australia, is there ways that they can they ask for their images to be put into their contract and negotiate some sort of fee if the clubs want to use them for advertising?
Yeah, so typically what happens is, say for the larger sports like AFL, NRL, their employment, the employees or the athletes' rights are sort of collectively negotiated through entry into a collective bargaining agreement. So usually at that level, that's where the negotiations take place in relation to the use of the image, how that can be used, and what benefits the athletes actually receive from the use of their image. So that can be from at a club level, as well as sort of each athlete, how they're actually remunerated or compensated for the use of their image. So that's typically how they do it in the larger sports. But then in your sort of smaller sports where, there's not as much money being thrown into it, there's no association effectively or union bargaining on your behalf, then it really is sort of an individual negotiation. That's sometimes the issue, is that you have a number of people or athletes individually negotiating to try and determine how their image would be used, and it can get quite messy. But absolutely, there's an opportunity for athletes to have those negotiations, have those discussions. The question ultimately is, how much negotiation power do you have? So obviously, through the NRL and the AFL, you're dealing collectively with all the athletes. So it's a lot easier to negotiate there with the governing body, whereas in the smaller sports where there is no union or, again, association, the governing body is in a really good position to be able to say, well, we'll just do what we need to do, and we're not going to necessarily make too many concessions for your benefit because we want control. So it really depends on the level at which you're operating, and the willingness of the governing body to come to the table.
Okay. And then on that part, does that then can that potentially limit any outside sponsorship opportunities athletes can take up?
Yeah, potentially. And ultimately, it depends on what the arrangements are at the governing body level, also at the team level. So again, in your professional sporting space, I suppose you would call it, the clubs have certain obligations to their sponsors. The governing bodies do as well. So they're going to want to protect their interests and make sure that they're not putting their sponsors offside. So there's obviously going to be certain restrictions around the use of your image in certain settings, especially obviously using your image in combination with a club logo or a governing body logo. So it is important to actually ensure you're aware of what the scope of those rights are, so that personally for each athlete they can sort of commercialize their own image and start deriving an income from other sources outside of the game.
Yeah. Because I guess in some instances, athletes can obviously earn a lot of money just from playing, whereas in others, the players might not earn as much, say, for their salary as such, but can pick up a lot of money in sponsorship and endorsement. So something like as trivial and to bring it back to like a real life scenario, if your club was, say, sponsored by Adidas, but you were approached by Nike to wear their boots or their apparel, how would you negotiate, or is that a tricky situation, or is that something that happens quite often that people need to sort of overcome?
Yeah, so that's something that each athlete would have to deal with on a sort of an individual basis with the club and with the governing body as well. So whenever an athlete, and again, I'm talking from the perspective of sort of the larger sports, but typically when there's a sponsorship like that, or most sponsorships, there is an approval process that needs to be followed. So if that were the case, athlete would then have to go to the club, go to the governing body and say, this is what I propose to do. Do you have any issues with me doing that? And if there are inconsistencies or crossover, then the players will have to have a discussion about what the scope of that sponsorship could be like to ensure that there's no infringement or any breach of any other obligations owed to the existing sponsors or any other third parties.
Through the club. And would they approach that through their agent initially, or is that somewhere where you'd obviously speak to your agent, but is this where you would maybe bring in or contact someone like yourself to look over the agreements and what's involved?
Yeah, well, I think even at the early stage, as soon as something is being drawn up, I think that's important, an important time for agents to sort of recognise it's probably when the work goes outside of the scope of their engagement as well. So, I mean, there's sponsorships everywhere, that have been thrown to athletes of varying values. And so, when you're talking about the smaller sponsorships, then, typically you say, well, you might be okay to just push on because there's limited risk there. But when you start talking about the larger value transactions or the long-term transactions, that's when we really say we need to be involved pretty early. But then if an athlete or an agent does get sort of a pushback from the club or a governing body and they think that probably no reason for it, we can of course get involved there and then have a look at how we can make things work, because as commercial lawyers, we don't want to be be seen to be an obstacle or a hurdle. Our job is really to make sure that everyone can find a way forward together in a way that sort of promotes and benefits everyone.
Yeah, I guess on that case as well, you'd want to tread carefully, that you don't want people thinking you're causing trouble, but you're just trying to understand, what you're entitled to or what you can and can't do.
Exactly right, and that's when you start looking at the scope of the agreements. What rights and obligations are there, and is there a way, effectively, is what we would look at. Is there a way for these things to coexist? And if there's not, then okay, well, we're going to have to find another way to deal with it. But if there is a way that we can find, a way forward together, then that's sort of our job, is to see what that could look like.
Yeah. And then in regards to, like, just say, and it probably varies quite largely, but like a standard player agreement in a large sport, what are the key considerations that they should be looking for outside, as I say, of your salary and your frequency of pay?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's really around the use of personal information, use of the image. So they're the main ones. Again, in the larger sports, you've got your standard form contracts, and you're not really allowed to deviate away from those standard terms without approval. So most of the time in those larger sports, that's already been sort of negotiated. The players' associations or the other unions will step in there and obviously make sure that everything's where they want it to be based on previous consultation with the players. So, as I said, there's been a lot more attention being placed on athletes' rights, and the players' associations becoming a lot more active and are starting to realise they probably have a bit more power than they probably thought they did in the past. So you're seeing a lot more protections being provided for athletes in those standard form contracts based on those discussions and negotiations.
Okay. And then if, and look, this, because it falls out of your jurisdiction, but if you do have, just say you've taken the deal overseas, right, and just looking at these basketballers I spoke with, they were going to countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, right? This is where they're playing. After Israel even, after a few weeks and they haven't been paid, which is, quite standard from a lot of people I speak to be honest,
Right.
that, they might not be getting paid on time every time. What's the sort of, outside of your agent, what's your first step in trying to, I guess, get that back on track?
Yeah, well, it's actually an interesting issue, and I haven't actually had to deal with this in overseas jurisdiction. Obviously, we deal with commercial transactions, and international transactions in the commercial world, but not necessarily in the sporting space. But in that event, if there is a situation where an athlete's not being paid on time, I mean, the agent obviously has to raise it, or the athlete if they're comfortable with doing that. It's all about sort of making sure the tone of communications are still friendly. Because we're all sort of, again, working together. We want to make sure that it's a long-lasting and beneficial relationship. So we need to make sure that any communication across is not combative, because that's just going to cause issues for everyone. So if, of course, after discussions between the athlete and the club, or the agent and the club, things aren't really going where they should be, then we obviously look back at the terms of the contract and see what the process is. So most contracts will have a dispute resolution procedure. So that'll sort of set out, in the event that situations like this occur, what do we do? What's the process? And who can be involved? So in most commercial contracts and other sporting contracts, you'll have an opportunity to effectively set out like a dispute notice. That'll set out the details of the dispute, what you want to achieve from the matter, and then provides parties with an opportunity to sort of negotiate it or discuss amongst themselves before they take it to the next step. So with athletes, that's also something you should be looking at when you're actually signing a contract, is if things do go that way, then what are we going to do about it? And is there a set process there that we can sort of hold the other party accountable to? Because in the absence of a dispute resolution procedure, it's quite messy. The parties don't know what they need to do, and no one's compelled to really to do anything. So, agreeing to the structure of that sort of procedure to begin with can be quite beneficial. It allows you the opportunity to actually have that process, know what you need to provide to the other party as far as details are concerned, and then sort of provides you with that opportunity to resolve it prior to getting third parties involved. And typically after you fail to resolve disputes between yourselves, you usually do get a third party involved, such as like a mediator, to try and resolve the disputes. Some people might skip mediation and say, let's go to arbitration instead. But it's always good to have a 3 or 4 step approach to resolving disputes prior to actually commencing proceedings or reaching a forum where a binding decision's made. So that's again where we come in, and we make sure that prior to entry we're thinking about how do we get there. Obviously we want to try and avoid disputes at all costs. No one likes going through those situations, but we want to make sure that there is a process to be followed.
And is that something like a dispute resolution clause or procedures? Is that something that you should find in most contracts?
Yeah, so if it's not in the contract, it could be in other governing documents as well. So when you sign up to a playing contract, they always say you obviously have to comply with any other rules or bylaws that are adopted from time to time. And if it's not in the contract itself, it will be set out typically in those other documents. So it's not just a case, especially when we're talking about international contracts. Obviously, it still applies in your local ones as well, but it is really important to look at the contract, but also all the other governing documents as well, because that might be where you find out about use of your personal information or use of your image and what you might be entitled to. So the contract itself may not necessarily have all the information that you need,
but it might direct you to a CBA or something similar.
Exactly right.
Yeah, okay. And then another point, I guess, which would be a step further than that, but in the same sort of theme of things, is contract termination. Now, whether that's, I guess, pushed by yourself if you're not happy, or pushed by the club because you're not performing, how do players sort of protect themselves, in that realm? Or like that of one of the girls I spoke to last week, they were with a player in Israel. She just was completely homesick. A US, didn't even tell her team, just got on a flight and went home, just disappeared. So obviously that's going to cause issues, but how would you address that, or what can the players do to sort of protect themselves, or at least, I guess, preempt, how do we go about this type of thing if I need to go home and I want to go home?
Yeah, so that's something to I think consider before you enter into the contract as well. Is what if it isn't what I want it to be? Once if I something like this happens, or even when you consider international playing contracts, is the ability to travel back home as well, and at what intervals can you come home? Um, so that's something that needs to be discussed in the first instance with the club. Obviously, if you have an agent representing your interests, and you obviously negotiate through them. Termination rights are quite interesting because usually it is the club that has more of the termination right than the athlete themselves. So it's usually a bit more favouring or favours the club and the governing body
Employer in a
themselves.
way, yeah.
Yeah, and that's obviously in there to make sure that the club's protected, and obviously they're large organisations as well, so they need to make sure their interests are protected. So if there are doubts or there are any concerns that it may not last for long, then obviously you need to have that chat in the front end. I mean, ultimately with termination and with employment generally, when an employee doesn't want to work for the employer, typically it is sort of in the employer's best interest to let them go anyway. So it is obviously important to negotiate termination rights to give the athletes some sort of flexibility. But ultimately, and you see it all the time, if an athlete says they want out or they want to move back home or something like that, then you're not going to get it as a club. You're not going to get the most out of them. So at those points in time, the club will have to consider whether it is in their interest to actually hold on to the employee and make them stay, or otherwise let them go and negotiate some sort of exit terms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's an interesting one because of just from discussions I've had with people, they might take a deal like I've had girls, even guys that have either gone to Israel, Saudi, and these places that they've never been to before. Like it's their first time maybe out of their home country, and they've signed a contract through an agent, and then they get there and it's like, wow, shit, I don't want to be here. What do we do now?
Yeah, absolutely.
And is that the same with? So I was just going to say, is that the same with an agent? So if you've found an agent, which again I keep coming across this, where they might have found someone, they don't feel like they're being represented properly, or that they're getting what they were sold, sold the dream.
Yeah, of course.
Is it a similar thing in regards to terminating an agreement with an agent? How easy is that?
Yeah, so again, sort of depends on what sport we're talking about, because NRL, come back as an example, they have standard form player and agent agreements that set out the termination rights aren't necessarily allowed to be deviated from without approval. I've worked on both sides of these kinds of disputes. So acting for the athlete with a dispute with the agent, acting for the agent in a dispute with the athlete. So, of course, the termination rights, each party's right is governed by the terms of the contract. And most of the time there is a contract in place. You'll have for the larger sports those standard form ones. So they'll set out, what each party can do at certain points in time. So where the issues come up are, the smaller sports where there is no standard form contract and it's really up to negotiation between the parties. That's where issues can arise, because sometimes you might have an agent that wants to sign an athlete for 4 years, and there may not be termination rights all the way through, for convenience, so without cause, and that can sometimes be an issue. Sometimes athletes do want to get out early, or they feel like their interests aren't being represented properly, and it's sometimes difficult to mount an argument to say they actually have a recognised termination right based on a material breach of a contract. So for athletes, we've always been wary of signing up to long-term agreements, especially when you can't get out early if you don't like it. Obviously for agents though, they want to be remunerated for the work that they've done as well. So if there are contracts that have been negotiated, typically the contract will say they're still entitled to their commission for the contracts that are negotiated. But again, it's a matter of negotiation between the parties as to what that looks like. And again, there are more protections in those larger sports now. For some athletes, they have certain periods of time. So I understand it's around 2 years, I think it is, the maximum period of time where an athlete can be signed up for an agent with an agent, and then after that you can actually terminate for convenience. So there are some protections in place, but again, for an athlete, signing with an agent, it's a big step. It's a very big step to take. It's a leap of faith, and a lot of careers can be determined by the quality of an agent. So, sometimes when the athletes are coming up, they're a bit young. They probably haven't had exposure to a wide range of agents. Don't know a good service from a bad one either. So it's important for for athletes not to lock themselves into something long term, because they'll need to assess whether that's actually right for them. And again, it goes the same. The same goes for sporting contracts as well. You don't want to sign up for too long if you're not sure about it. So it's always important to just get someone to run their eyes over it, to make sure that interests are protected. And again, there's more money in sports now, so you can sort of justify the cost a bit more. And sometimes people just jump in and hope for the best. And sometimes that's all they can do because maybe they can't afford legal advice at the time. But it's important when possible that they actually do get advice to make sure that their interests are protected. And again, everything says what they think it says.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's it was the next question was, would you highly recommend, a young athlete? Because like that, if you're offered your first professional contract, whatever age you are, like obviously you just want to sign it, you just want to, you want to achieve your dreams, but there are a lot of things to think about. And not that we want to bash agents, because some agents do a fantastic job and really have your best interests at heart. But unfortunately, there's a lot of stories of, vice versa, where they're looking out for themselves. So I guess from an agent point of view and a player point of view, it's probably worth both of them checking things out and just making sure that it's a win-win for both parties.
Yeah, exactly right. So as you said, there's plenty of good agents out there, and in all of the sports as well. So it's just a matter of making sure that the terms are commercial, and the underlying tone of everything is we're all working together. We're all acting with the one goal in mind, and that's obviously to advance the athlete's interests. So again, it's just a matter of making sure that we don't lock ourselves into something for longer than we need to, and making sure that you actually do your research, make sure that the people you surround yourself with are the people that are going to be best suited to protect your interests and further them moving forward.
And on that part, then with sponsorships, what are, if you've come across it before, I guess some of the red flags as such, or things to be aware of if you're going to enter an agreement with a sponsor, with a commercial partner?
Yeah, of course. So as you said, sometimes for athletes, the income that they actually generate from sponsorships can exceed the amount they're actually entitled to under their playing contract. So this is obviously a very important part of their career and their life generally. So for us, we always want to be involved in sponsorships when there's a contract involved, any kind of endorsement contract. We just want to have a look at that to make sure the athlete's rights are adequately protected. And when I talk about the rights, again, we're looking at image rights. So again, an athlete themselves don't really have a recognised right to the use of their own image. So that's quite important to realise. But we can get the protections in through contracts. So what we'd be doing there is we'd be saying, okay, what does the sponsor really need to promote the affiliation with the athlete? How are they going to do it? What images, what names are they going to use? And what degree of control does the athlete have over that? So there we're really looking at approval rights in relation to the use of the image. So before an image goes out, the sponsor then is required to go to the athlete and say, this is what we propose to do. Are you okay with this? Does it convey the message that you're happy with? And then in relation to image rights as well, we want to have a look at how long those images can be used for as well. So I've seen contracts before where you have a 4-year term for an agreement, and then there's an image right provided to the other party for 15 years. So 11 years after the contract's been terminated. So you want to make sure that your image is used when you want it to be, and for as long as you want it to be as well, because for athletes, specifically those on the rise, you want to be making sure you're not giving too much away, because that image, those affiliations can be worth quite a lot. And if you've got these lingering rights owed or obligations owed to other or previous sponsors, then that can sort of reduce the value of the future contracts as well. So we want to tie that up, make sure it says exactly what we want it to say, to make sure that obviously rights are protected now, but also into the future.
And just to dumb that down a little bit in in a real life sense. If I've signed with sponsor A and I've got a 2-year agreement, but in the back of the contract, I haven't read it, they've got a 10-year image rights.
Yep.
So for the next 8 years, they can keep using my image and promote their goods using myself, but I don't get a cent. I'm not entitled to anything. But is that how it would work?
Well, yeah, well, that's right. So sometimes, and again, this was quite a unique contract that I saw that contained that clause, but that's effectively how it would operate. So you're provided with the services, but then there's an ongoing right provided to the other party that survives termination effectively. And because that's just an advertising right, there's really no revenue share arrangement or anything connected with that. So yeah, there was nothing tied to it, and the other party was effectively allowed to use that image for that period without any other compensation to the athlete.
It's a long time.
It is a long time, and again, I had the conversation with the athlete and said, well, this contract says, there's a 15-year image right here or a license. He said, I wasn't aware. I just, I negotiated myself. I sort of trusted the guy, and I thought that would work out, but actually in that matter, I was dealing with a breakdown in the relationship. So it was one of those things where I'd say, well, this is what they're potentially entitled to, and we need to figure out what we need to do to protect your interests moving forward.
Wow. And on that then, and again, it's probably quite a very open question because it could be so different, but do you find when you look at athlete sponsorship agreements that it's usually an upfront payment the athlete might get, or it's like that, a revenue share, or it's just split over, a 12-month period? Is there anything that stands out more than others, or not really?
Usually it depends on the products. It depends on the arrangement. Say, for example, if you have your own signature shoe, then there's obviously, you're going to be asking for revenue share entitlements. But if it is just a sort of a standard basic sponsorship, you'll usually see like an annual fee being paid to the athlete, and they'll receive that. But otherwise, there's other incentives as well. If they, reach certain heights, if they get representative honours, then they might be entitled to other bonuses and stuff in connection with that sponsorship. But otherwise, it ultimately depends on the transaction, what you're trying to achieve, because you might have a sponsorship in its truest form where you have a right to use an image in connection with, in return for the provision of goods or services, for example. Other times you might have some sort of arrangement where the athlete actually is offered equity in the business or the company that's promoting certain products or services. So that's when things get a bit more complicated, and at that point in time we say absolutely you need to get advice, because we need to make sure that everything's tied up, because those kind of arrangements can last for a very long time.
And do the players, I guess the players could have it could be a really good collaborative type approach. If you find a good sponsor and like that, you're an up and coming athlete that hopefully you can sit down and negotiate or get maybe a lump sum, but in year 2 we might, if things are going well, then we get a revenue share. In year 3 we can buy into 10% of the business or whatever it may be.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, and I think it's rewarding athletes for increased reach as well. So if you look at some of the top athletes in each of the sport, obviously the young ones coming through, they might not have that kind of value right now, but in a few years' time, they'll be reaching a lot more people than what they were at the start of the contract. So as the athlete and obviously for agents, you want to make sure that there is an ability to unlock that value later down the track. So incorporating those kind of bonuses or incentives within the document will obviously, assist the athlete in realizing their true value.
And just on that, it just popped into my head there, but the influence of social media in those types of things, then how, obviously it's important, but do you have protection over your social media? Do you need to then sign over, not access as in day-to-day access, but, is that part of where a sponsor might come to you and say, all right, but you need to make 10 posts a year about our company, something like that?
Yeah, so usually for a sponsor, you're looking for the benefits. You want to try and lock in and provide certainty and clarity around what you're actually going to get. So an athlete might say, well, a sponsor might say, we want, to post, 2 or 3 times about our products. We'll give you the products. You do what you need to do. It can be more informal. Again, if you're talking about a low value transaction, they might not have too many controls around it. But then when you're talking about the higher value ones, and the sponsor is going to want to have a fair bit of control about what the content looks like. But so they're not necessarily going to hand over control, but there will be controls around what images can be used, and the sponsor's right to sort of disagree with the publication of certain images. But otherwise, in relation to the use of social media, sponsors are always going to want effectively what's called like a morality clause in their contract. So that's when, again, for athletes, it's important for them to understand what they're signing up for, because these morality clauses, which are effectively a clause which says if you have done something that is considered to be wrong, or maybe it has the potential to be wrong, or you committed a crime or something like that could potentially affect the sponsor's reputation or even the athlete's reputation, then the sponsors typically provide themselves with a termination right, or a way to get out. So that's when we look at social media. Obviously, people are free to post really what they want online, but when you start crossing some moral boundaries, then sponsors might start looking at the terms of their contract to see what they can and can't terminate the contract for. And morality clauses are always negotiated. They're always argued over, because a sponsor wants obviously a wide-ranging morality clause. Effectively, if you do anything that they consider to be wrong, then they can get out. Whereas an athlete effectively wants it to be narrow and says, okay, well, let's actually define what this is, what kind of conduct you're trying to control, so that I know what I can and can't do, and I'm not going to have that uncertainty lingering every time I post or post something on my Instagram, or post a story, anything like that.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it would probably cause some sort of limit to what you can then put on social media, because it could be religious, it could be political, it could be it could be a number of things which then cause a red flag for the company that are paying you to post other stuff.
Yeah, exactly right. And obviously in this day and age, companies are very protective over their image. They understand that there's a lot that can sort of create outrage now. So they're really sensitive about what they're going to allow, particularly when again, you're talking about those high value transactions where someone might be known as like a Puma athlete or a Nike athlete, for example. In those circumstances, they're really going to want those controls to make sure they have the final say over who's actually going to be an ambassador for their brand.
Yeah, no, definitely, it's very important. As you say, is just one word in someone's podcast, video, whatever, it just can get turned around and splashed over social media very quickly and taken the wrong way.
Yeah, 100%.
And something you mentioned at the start, which I'll touch on there. So with say an athlete, they're on a salary and they get some bonuses, et cetera, but they want to start taking up sponsorships or doing something away from sport and using their image. Is that where you would advise, and I'll be guided by you here, but setting up a different structure outside of your personal brand?
Yeah. So from a liability perspective, obviously on the legal side, we like to see when athletes are starting their own venture or enterprise, as we'd call it, separate to their sport, it would be ideal from our perspective for a separate structure. And when I say structure, a company or something to be set up, sometimes a trust as well, just to limit the personal liability for the athlete. So sometimes from a tax perspective, and accountants would be best to talk about that. But from a tax perspective, you might not necessarily be able to avoid any income coming through, especially when you're talking about image rights. You might not be able to avoid that tax being assessed in your hands as an individual. But when you start talking about your sort of more commercial activities, such as starting your own business, or most athletes like to try and capitalize on their brand or their reputation by starting a clothing business, for example. And when you're doing that, from our perspective, it's always important for a company to be set up to protect the individual from anything that happens in connection with the running of that kind of business. So that's the best way from our perspective, to set things up. And again, you might have a trust involved as well that can provide certain advantages for the athlete. But whenever we start talking about businesses, we start talking about structures, and not just running things in our own name.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. That's what I thought. And do you find that, and then the transition from, say, people getting close to retirement, is there anything they have to be aware of, or again, is it just a conversation around what do we do next? And there might be a structure needs to be set up, or there might be, just ways to wind things down.
Yeah, so I mean, ideally for an athlete, and again, this is where agents come in as well, the conversation about retirement and what happens post-sport should really happen immediately, even at the start of the career. I know personally for me, I had a rugby league background, and going through school all the way to almost the finish of high school, my plan A and my only plan was to play rugby league. And I was in some ways fortunate enough to actually acquire a spinal injury towards the end of school, which actually forced me to think about the plan B and gave me enough time to actually take the necessary steps to set myself up for a career outside of sports. So and for athletes, it can happen overnight. You're one sort of ACL away from retirement effectively. So it's important for athletes and their agents to be aware that you're going to be an athlete for a finite period of time, and we need to make sure that there is a plan in place from the outset as to what we're going to do, how we're going to capitalize on the use of this identity throughout your playing career, but also once it is time to hang up the boots or whatever you want to do, there should be a seamless transition. And again, in the larger sports, you're seeing the setup through for rugby league, got the RLPA. They're doing a really good job at the moment with transitioning athletes into retirement. But that conversation doesn't take place at retirement. It takes place well prior, so that athletes are thinking about it. And then when it is time to hang up the boots, they already know what they're doing, or they're already doing it. And some athletes already have their businesses they're running. So it is sort of a seamless transition. What you don't want to have is have that conversation in the back end or after you've acquired an injury, and then you're trying to figure out what you're doing whilst also dealing with what most athletes do, which is an identity crisis. So that's really important.
Yeah, it was another thing that came up a few weeks ago in a conversation. Someone that had started a business 5 years ago. They're still playing now, but because it gives you sort of, I guess, risk-free in a way to try things. You've got your salary through sport, and even though you have to have, especially at the top level in sport, you have to have such focus on your sport to perform at that level. But as you say, you potentially one injury away from it being over, or a bad contract or a bad agent, whatever it may be. So it is important to keep that. And I think it also helps take your mind off, the day-to-day training, performing. You do also need something else. And if you can think about, just putting plans in place, not for retirement, but for sports retirement to then catapult you into something new. Because as you say, it can be an identity crisis. A lot of people struggle with that transition from finishing playing whatever sport they're doing to what do we do next?
No, absolutely. And I mean, for professional athletes, there is usually a fair bit of downtime for them. So it'd be great if nothing else, and this is sort of veering away from strictly legal advice, but if they're focusing on, running their own business as opposed to, sitting around, there's a lot of obviously issues with gambling and things like that with professional athletes who do have a lot of time and obviously a lot of money as well. But that's where obviously, again, agents and the governing bodies come in to try and provide support and provide the education. And that's sort of my role as well, and my objective through provision of legal advice is to sort of assist athletes in understanding what they can do and what they really should be thinking about now from our a legal perspective to ensure that they set themselves up for success again during their career, but also post career.
Yeah, and it's a big driver behind this whole overseas athlete idea is, if you need help with currency, obviously we've got SportsFX. You need legal help, you need tax help, you need, advice around sponsorships. And it's just having the right people there that, you can reach out to, ask some questions. You might not use it now, but at least if you've got some sort of network of good, trusted professionals, it can just help you along the way while you're trying to juggle, a lot of things.
Yeah, no, and I agree completely. So, again, my objective is to educate, but also to provide my clients with a wide network of service providers as well that will assist them moving forward as well. Because, again, we talked about agents, but an athlete's career can be determined by the quality of their support network. So if we can support athletes by having the right people around them from the outset, people who are used to working together, then things can be a lot easier for the athlete. They can focus on what they need to focus on, and then they know that everything else has been looked after by the network around them.
Yeah. No, fantastic. And that's probably a fantastic way to wrap it up, because we're both on the same page. That's obviously why, I've got you on, because we're passionate about it. And I know from talking to these athletes that they do need help in all these areas. So the more, professional and, well-equipped service providers we can put in front of them, the better. So Matthew, thank you very much for your time and your information today. And I'll obviously post all of your details and contact details on this, at the bottom of this podcast.
Yeah, perfect. No, thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
No problem at all.